Hello everybody and welcome to today's lesson on rhombuses, rectangles and squares. Today our objective is we will be able to verify characteristics of different types of parallelograms and use their properties to solve real-world problems. Let's recall what is a quadrilateral. A quadrilateral is a four-sided polygon, and quadri really stands for four, and lateral means sides. In the last class, we started talking about parallelograms, and parallelograms are quadrilaterals that have the following six properties. First of all, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. That means that this side has to be parallel to this side, and this side here on top has to be parallel to the side in the bottom. Also, both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. So this side to the left has to be congruent to the side to the right, and the side at the top has to be congruent to the side at the bottom. And if we combine the two previous characteristics, we can say that one pair, and we should really say at least one pair of opposite sides, is parallel and congruent. So this side on top has to be parallel to the side at the bottom, and they also have to be congruent. If we know this, that is enough to determine that this is a parallelogram. Now let's move to angles. Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. So this angle here at the bottom left has to be congruent to the angle at the top right, and the angle at the top left has to be congruent to the angle at the bottom right. Also, all consecutive angles are supplementary. So remember, consecutive means next to each other. So these two angles, if, for example, this angle measures 100 degrees, then the angle next to it has to measure 80 degrees. So together they add up to 180. But that has to go in all directions. So also this angle with the other one next to it have to add up to 180. That means that the one in the bottom here has to be 100 degrees. All consecutive angles are supplementary. And last but not least, let's talk about diagonals. The diagonals bisect each other. So how are we going to mark this? If we put our diagonals into our diagram here, they meet in the middle, and that cuts each of them in two congruent pieces. Diagonals bisect each other. And now let's talk about different types of parallelograms. A parallelogram can be either a rhombus or a rectangle. A rhombus is a parallelogram that has three more properties. First of all four sides are congruent. That means this side is not just congruent to this one, and this not just congruent to this, but all four are congruent. That means I can mark them with the same congruence mark. Also, all diagonals are perpendicular. So if I put my diagonals into my diagram, they cross each other at a 90-degree angle. They are perpendicular. And lastly, each diagonal bisects the opposite angles. So our diagonals that go through our rhombus like this. The top diagonal cuts the angle there in two congruent angles, and they are also congruent to each other and to the two angles at the bottom. And the other diagonal cuts those two angles in four congruent pieces as well. A rectangle is a different type of parallelogram, and that has two other properties on top of all the properties of parallelogram. In a rectangle, all four angles are right angles. That means all four of them are congruent and measure 90 degrees. All four angles are right angles. Also, in the rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. So if I mark my two diagonals in the rectangle, not only do they bisect each other, which makes these two pieces the same length, but these two pieces are not only congruent to each other, but also congruent to the other two pieces. So all four halves of the diagonals are congruent, and the two full diagonals are congruent as well. So do remember the difference between rhombuses and rectangles. In a rhombus, all four sides are congruent. In a rectangle, all four angles are congruent. And then we have squares. A square is a parallelogram that is both a rhombus and a rectangle, and therefore it has all the characteristics that we have listed above and discussed. So that means that not only is this side congruent to the opposite side, it's also congruent to the other two sides. All four sides are congruent, and all four angles are congruent, which means that they are all 90 degrees right angles. Alright, so much for the characteristics and properties of the different types of parallelograms. Make sure that you study those and memorize those. And now go ahead and watch the second part of this tutorial, where we will go through some examples.